So the first thing I want to talk about is Bat's Tower. I find it interesting how the top half of the tower is a kind of old style, old technology kind of tower, right? The cogwheel mechanism is an old style technology in comparison to the underground of the tower. When you go below that level, it becomes this sort of almost spaceship, futuristic kind of almost military base kind of technology. And that has a sort of psychedelic, dreamlike feel to it, which I think is echoed in the barn scene as well. In the barn scene, the top half of the barn is, just an old style barn, and you're fighting a haystack. But then when you descend down into the underworld, the haystack is revealed to be a very high technology, futuristic robot, also with sort of a military kind of feel to it. I'm not sure what to say about this other than just that it seems that this sharp transition between the upper part and the lower part seems to correspond nicely with just a general idea of the underworld in mythology, right? That the underworld or hell or the unconscious is here being portrayed as extremely technological. Like there's something under the roots of whatever is going on above that is extremely sort of complex and alien looking or something, threateningly futuristic. Whereas the top half is almost anachronically old, right? Considering the game is released at a point in time when the upper world is old in comparison, but the lower world is futuristic in comparison. So the game sits in the middle between the upper world and the lower world in this case. And I'm not sure. I mean, let's look at what happens in those places, right? I mean, the lower world of the barn is the robot, okay. But the lower world of Bat's Tower is also a robot-like character, a robot-like boss, in that it's this sort of mechanized boiler. And this mechanized boiler, I'm really curious what its function is in this whole system, in the Bat's Tower specifically. What is it heating? From a psychedelic sort of dreamlike way, it seems to simply represent heat itself. And I say this because it seems that mechanisms in this game are, on the one hand, obviously, it's a game, so any sort of mechanisms in this game are fairly simple, but their simplicity also carries like a symbolic value. I say this because the cogs, Carl and Quentin and Mr. Big Cog, they seem to only serve the purpose of shortening or lengthening the piece of rope that ties the bullfish to his pole or whatever, right? So it has this comical side to it that it's a huge mechanism that seems to only serve that purpose, but at the same time, it also gives a huge importance to that purpose, I think. And so anyway, I suppose that that's the thing with mechanisms in this game, that the boiler doesn't necessarily have to be connected to any other part of the game. It doesn't necessarily have to serve a purpose within the structure of the building. It may just be a boiler because in underground, in video games, in movies, the underground cellar is usually a place where you find a boiler. So it might just serve the purpose of being, representative of heat in the underworld. And it also sort of introduces a theme that we see throughout this game, which is of class, I think. There is a theme of class, that the boiler is a bourgeois boiler. And Conker has been encountering, I think, this sort of like some sort of a class difference at different points in the game. In fact, the mission we're on now, the Bats Tower mission, begins because Conker is asked by a group of blue-blooded fish to serve as a disposable soldier for them, almost, right? And so there is this sort of theme of rich or sort of upper class characters taking advantage of lower class characters. And it's interesting because so let's go back to the boiler, for example. As I said, the boiler seems to represent heat. I think this is also because the boiler appears next to the fire imps. So the fire imps are just like a small version of the big guy, right? When the fire imps want to have a bigger body, they summon the big guy. They use him and they control him. So it's almost as if the boiler is just a bigger version of the imp, symbolically. And the imp is just a fire creature. They represent sort of fire itself. And so this whole web of things gets a bit complicated because we have, on the one hand, there's the cogs. And in the cogs themselves, there is also, on the one hand, there's a duality about gender and performance of gender and sexuality, right? There is, on the one hand, Carl as extremely heterosexual, masculine, and Quentin as sort of effeminate, gay. And they both are the same cog, so they seem to be two sides of the same coin. But not just that, because Conker also, gets mad at Quentin for being snobbish and upper class. Like, he's smoking one of these kind of long cigarette things. So there is also there seems to be a class difference between Carl and Quentin, as there is between the fishes, the catfishes, and the bullfish. Right? It's sort of as if the bullfish is seen by the catfish as lower than them, rough, a brute, right? And they see themselves as superior. So there is also this sort of duality between feeling above someone else or feeling below them in some sort of a class power structure of different kinds appears all throughout the game, and in this case all throughout the Bats Tower arc, in ways that resonate with one another. Because again, if in this sort of psychedelic way the brute, the macho, masculine side is being associated to a lower class aspect, and the higher class to a more sort of feminine side, then the game is playing through different sort of dualities of this kind. Like I said, Carl and Quentin are the same cog. They're united. There is some sort of something that the psychedelic vision of the game is sort of trying to maybe blend the boundary between these two things. And it does so in many cases. For example, on the one hand, okay, so the big boiler person is considered a bourgeois boiler, but has these huge testicles, which are like the classic symbol of masculinity or something. In fact, the only reason the boiler dies is because you kick its balls off. So, the balls are the life force of the boiler. After all, taking it back to a more, let's say, mythological sense, fire tends to be associated to passion, to instinct, to things pertaining to the lower part of the body, let's say, right? So it's almost as if the boiler room is not only below the ground, but it is also representative of heat, of fire. In this case, the fire of libido, for example, right? So that's why I think the balls are the life force of the boiler. And there is a way in which I think Conker is being reflected in all this. He's seeing himself reflected in all this because the imps are recreating kind of the scene that Conker was doing at the start of the game. That they're doing what Conker was doing at the start of the game, which is drinking and smoking, right? It's the reason that Conker is having a bad fur day is because of his night at the pub. And the thing here, I think, is that what did the night at the pub kind of entail? Several things happened at the pub. One of them is that Conker lies to Barry, right? He gives some excuse why he can't be home and then stays at the pub drinking. That's one of the things. The other thing, and I probably won't be able to get into this too much, but the other thing is that he is tricked by his friends into paying another round. At least it is assumed, I suppose, that that's what's going on. That he is so drunk that he is being taken advantage of by his friends. So a whole set of things are happening at the pub, I think. On the one hand, Conker is lying to his girlfriend in order to stay with his friends. But actually, they don't seem to be friends in several ways. First, because we don't see them. They're just sort of like an anonymous mass of people at the pub. And secondly, because they seem to be taking advantage of him. The only reason I mention this is because I think that the theme of toxic friendship appears in this game as if it were, again, kind of a psychedelic vision, that is expressing Conker's inner turmoil. One of the cases is simply like, the paintbrush and the paint pot, right? Just a relationship based on, a friendship that doesn't quite work. That's based on just trying to be liked without actually liking or something like that. And the way this relates to Barry, I guess, is that it seems almost as if Conker is here prioritizing his male friends over his girlfriend, even though they don't seem to have his best interests at heart, and even though the experience seems to lead him towards a bad time, right? And so it's as if the game is showing us examples of the prioritization of male sort of toxic male camaraderie in instead of the feminine. And the reason I'm saying this, I think, because obviously I'm speculating all of this from a very short pub cutscene, right? But the reason I'm saying it is because of the way it gets reflected back at us, I think, throughout the game. Like, for example, take the cogwheel scene. The cogwheel scene is such an extreme duality between a cartoonish masculinity and a cartoonish femininity, right? The female cogs are sort of cartoonishly feminine with makeup and lipstick and all that, and the masculine cog is cartoonishly masculine with this huge cigar in his mouth, right? It is literally borrowing from the language of cartoons, right? Big cigars and big makeup and things like that. So that that scene with the cogs is clearly sort of, I think it's clearly like expressing something about masculinity and femininity. On the one hand, at the end of the sequence, for example, the female cogs escape from Carl. So something is taking place. When Conker arrives on the scene, he finds a certain system in place. And this system is a system where Carl is basically enslaving 3 female cogs just to have sex, basically sort of sexually abusing them in a sort of systematic way, because the cogs themselves are visually a system of cogs, right? And so at the end, this system is overturned. So something is happening here. It's sort of as if Conker is encountering examples of a certain archetypal struggle, and as he approaches these little situations, these little sort of vignettes, this archetypal struggle resolves itself in different ways and in different directions, but it always tends to be something about masculinity, and especially sort of like insecure masculinity, something like that, right? As in the Ooga Booga scene or any other kind of case. And so, yeah, I think that the boiler, there is something similar going on with the boiler in that he is sort of this almost like an incarnation of masculinity in a way that Conker feels. He feels like he is now in this part of the game feeling disdain or repugnance for it, even though it is a part of himself. It is something that he has been doing in, or at least we could assume so, I suppose, by the fact that he lied to Barry and all of that. So it's again the Carl Quentin situation, that it's sort of Conker is seeing the other side of his own coin. This issue of, for example, of class, the class issue, it appears again in the zombie scene, in the vampire scene, because in that arc we discover that Conker has it seems as if Conker is the descendant of an extremely wealthy aristocratic family. So it's as if, right, Conker starts off at the bottom, then discovers that he is connected to the thing that he was fighting against, and then at the very end of the game, he actually becomes the aristocratic ruler. He becomes the king. As if sort of there has been well, it's hard to describe what the process has been, but something has happened that involves Conker looking at a reflection of himself. I think that through this game, he is looking at a reflection of himself, but not just of himself, because I think this is where the video game side of it comes in. That Conker isn't just a character, right? He's a character that's being played by different people around the world. And so what's happening in Conker, and I think what's happening in art in general, in some general sort of way, or can happen with art, is that you are looking at a mirror, not just of yourself, but of big archetypal things that are shared by many people. So some sort of there is a cultural mirror looking happening here in this game. One of the ways in which this seems to happen, I think, is that as we approach nighttime, some sort of an unconscious dream time, the personal unconscious becomes more of a collective unconscious. In nighttime, the issues that emerge in nighttime are issues of war, right? So something is being examined that is collective, that has to do with huge groups of people and huge power struggles amongst huge groups of people. So we're suddenly not in the realm of Conker's personal ordeals with masculinity and the pub and whatever it may be. There is some way in which the personal in Conker's life is being reflected back at him in the collective, thus making it much more powerful, making the examination that is taking place more powerful, I think. And yeah, so I think that there are many, many ways in which this game is acting as some sort of a mirror that is fractally looking at itself in all the different little vignettes, in the cog scene, in the poo scene, in the windmill scene, in all different kind of places of the game. Conker is encountering weird sort of reflections